Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming on a chilly Friday afternoon. I'm thrilled to be able to host Patrick Vonderau, who's visiting us this week from Germany. So it's nice to have an in-person guest from out of town, very out of town. And so just a little bit about Patrick. He's a professor of media and communication studies at the University of Halle, Germany, and an affiliate professor in film studies at Stockholm University in Sweden. He is the author or editor of 14 books. That's what your website says. And more than 70 articles and book chapters. So you've been busy. His most recent book publications include the co-authored Advertising and the Transformation of Screen Cultures, which came out last year, co-authored with both Lauren and Yvonne Zimmerman, and Spotify Teardown Inside the Black Box of Streaming Music through MIT Press in 2019, co-authored with Maria Eriksson, Rasmus Fleischer, Anna Johansson, and Pelle Snickers. And among the other many important books he's contributed to are Moving Data, the iPhone and the Future of Media, which is how we first started participating with that, The YouTube Reader, and Behind the Screen, European Production Cultures. Beyond his publishing work, Patrick is also co-founder of the European Network for Cinema and Media Studies, NECS. So today I'm looking forward to hearing his talk, and thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much for this super nice introduction and for the invite to contribute to the speaker series. And special thanks, of course, to Ben Hong and Elisa, and to all of you attending this afternoon. You will have to cope with my German accent, so good luck with that. It's my first time actually in Austin and in Texas, so I was thrilled to wander around a little bit and discover the city, and also to meet your fantastic faculty. And the radio, film, television department has always been sort of a super interesting place, seen from the outside, like from Europe. So I'm very happy to just reconfirm the very good impression I have gotten over the years. So we can really be proud, I guess, to be here. So my presentation today, I have scripted it actually because it's such a long slot, like 40 minutes on a Friday afternoon. So I figured I have to discipline myself a little bit. So it's written down, but in case you want to interrupt me, please feel free to doing so, and we can get into a more lively interaction. So my presentation today relates to the digital media economy, or where we try to bring together the distinctiveness of the digital as compared to prior economic processes with the distinctiveness of media as a cultural form. So what I will try to do today is to draw from 3 different of my projects in this area to make a broader argument about these so-called digital markets and about their relevance for media industries research overall. So this is partly still work in progress, so feedback is very much welcome, maybe afterwards over drinks if you have the opportunity. And it's not really a coherent, in-depth research presentation, but more like a broad summary of things we have learned in terms of concepts and methods. And I would love to discuss that with you. So the 3 projects which I'd like to briefly present and weave into this broader narrative are different points in their development. One has already been completed back in 2018. You heard the title of the resulting book. Another one received funding in 2018, but still needs to see its findings published. And the third we just started a few weeks ago as a pilot study while waiting for the results of a related grant application. So here are the 3 projects and their titles, and you know maybe the first one already. At least that's what I understood from Leslie yesterday. So here in the first project, Streaming Heritage, a guiding question was how people's practices and approaches toward cultural forms such as songs, books, or films are transformed under the shift from commodity ownership to commodified experience, like from paying to own as compared to paying for access. The second process, which you are not able to know anything about now because I have nothing published about this, apart from giving some presentations, studied or still studies the actors, sites, processes, and devices at the center of the internet shadow markets, often described as click farms in news media, that is persons or companies selling likes, followers, views, or Spotify plays among others via unregulated online marketplaces. And this very last project, which I'm most excited about, but will have the least time speaking of, we just started a few weeks back. And it pretty much builds on the others, and we felt that criticism of the digital economy or platforms, more specifically, almost always come too late. So the basic idea here is to do research in those secretive or gray areas of policymaking where public affairs specialists working for Google or Facebook try to influence European policymaking in Brussels, at the EU's headquarters, or in Berlin. So what we are planning here is sort of an ethnography of big tech lobbying, and it's surprisingly going well. We have actually access to the chief lobbyist of TikTok in Berlin. So as different as these three projects are, they all touch upon the same question of what a digital market is and how to draw conceptual and empirical boundaries around it, a question in each case provoked through encounters with Spotify. In doing so, all this research also resonates very much with a recent tendency in media industry studies, which is to look beyond the established media industries of publishing, journalism, cinema, radio, television, video, or games, acknowledging that media do not form a coherent sector anymore, if they then ever did. The authors of media industry studies note, for instance, that while there has long been a lot of, quote, uncertainty about boundaries and defining characteristics of media, the greatest uncertainty comes from the word industry itself, as the increasing availability of the tools of media creation and circulation make it unclear at what point media become industrialized, end of quote. In a similar vein, Paul MacDonald opens his Routledge Companion to Media Industries by reminding us that the so-called media industry not only is anything but, quote, a coherent totality, end of quote, it also remains an unstable object of research, as he puts it. Despite such calls for de-essentializing the media industry, most research in this area still focuses on some form of cultural content as the market-defining type of output. That is, while the more formal or normative viewpoints of media economics or political economy, respectively, have recently been complemented by a more reflexive attitude towards media industries, it's still largely content and access to content that we study. So when it comes to digital markets, more specifically, we usually start off from the idea, as borrowed from neoclassical institutional economics, that these markets are defined by a particular type of commodity and as such part of a larger capitalist economy. When many now agree that markets are social spaces constituted by history, politics, and culture, research on digital markets still follows a more abstract, sectorial approach, where exchange is discussed in relation to notions of property and ownership, supply and demand, competition and substitution, and what is inside and outside of a given market frame. And there are, of course, many good reasons to do so, as the great research that exists on digital markets clearly demonstrates. I nevertheless would like to argue today that the much described messiness of digital markets, or the difficulty of getting to terms with what really is new in the media industries as compared to what isn't, is not so much a feature of those markets, but of an analytical perspective that holds on to the idea of media as a sector in a wider capitalist economy. It gets particularly messy in regard to platforms, which on the one hand are hard to fit into the context of the media and communication sector, given the lack of traditional property laws, for instance, of traditional business communities or forms of professional labor, while having become synonymous with digital markets on the other. So how to solve this mess? My simple proposition is to start with the notion of industry. As defined by economic sociology, an industry is, quote, a set of markets, one of which is the core or leading market, and to which other markets are auxiliary, end of quote. So think of the traditional film industry in Hollywood's classic era as being composed of various markets, including markets for labor, cameras and projectors, raw film stock, real estate, content, services, and so on.
The advantage of seeing industries as composed of various markets is, first, that it invites cross-sectoral analysis, or how media link with non-media industries. Cross-sectoral analysis allows us, second, to discover so far unacknowledged relations between different markets that may change our pictures of the entire industry, as in Alice Lovejoy's upcoming book, for instance, on the linkages between the film and petrochemical and nuclear industries, entitled Militant Chemistry, Film and its Raw Materials. Decentering, if only for the sake of a thought experiment, what we always have taken for granted to be the leading market in a given industry, finally also prompts us to more properly historicize what we assume to be the key commodity or system of ownership and control in any given industry. Can you follow me so far, or is it hard to understand what I'm saying? Okay, otherwise we just have to shout or throw something at me. For instance, and now this is sort of not really a historical argument, I just try to historicize sort of our idea of what a commodity is. For instance, in terms of the core or leading market, classical Hollywood may be said to have been a cinema rather than a film industry, because ownership of real estate formed the economic grounds on which the motion picture business could thrive. Control over markets was based on control over the distribution control over the distribution to studio-owned exhibition venues, with the latter serving as sites to define consumption in terms of exclusionary temporary access to an ephemeral good. This is quite different from a system that, following the Paramount Decree in 1948, shifted into one based on copyright. Control over markets now consisted of the production of copyright-protected content and in the licensing of such content to players in and outside the traditional motion picture industry. And this is again quite different from what we might call a third paradigm, which beginning around the mid-1990s turned media into code and the business into one aimed at control over markets in terms of control in managing IP across platforms, and ultimately in controlling those platforms, the internet and the very idea of computing. Building on this notion of industry as a set of markets, and we'll soon be done with all this theoretical stuff, I promise, I'd like to make a second proposition, which is to finally acknowledge that understanding markets not merely involves asking questions about culture, it involves studying the cultural work of making those markets. Media industry scholars agree that markets have institutional and discursive dimensions in the sense of market boundaries being drawn institutionally or discursively, such as by making technology a defining feature of digital markets, for instance. Yet somewhat surprisingly, what often is lacking in such scholarship is an awareness of or interest in the concrete everyday practice of market making itself. This is all the more surprising as digital markets are not particularly well explained as institutions, a term that emphasizes stability, nor as discourse, a term that suggests a certain directedness or uniformity. Building a digital market is high drama. It's all about conflicting lines of economic, as we will see shortly. So here are some of the key research questions my colleagues and I have found fascinating to take up over the past years. How are markets actually organized? How are prices set, networks built? If markets work because people are allowed to exclude things, to deny responsibility for certain consequences, how does that work in practice? How do market actors themselves engage in drawing boundaries between legal and illegal, formal and informal, or in denying the existence of those boundaries? What does the very concrete everyday work of producing new modes of owning, controlling, and capitalizing on culture look and feel like? This idea to focus on market-making practices is not new, of course, but part of a broader research agenda that has developed at the interface of sociology, science and technology studies, part of an interdisciplinary turn towards both the logics of economic production and economic phenomena as something that is produced, or a sort of production turn, if you will. This again resonates very much with Nitin Goville's suggestion to, quote, think beyond media industries as institutional settings and to broaden the range of practices that count as industrial by asking what provisional forms, sites, and practices that constitute media industries. What are these formal and informal processes of assembly, and how do exchange practices move in and out of industry status? In other words, how are industries made up? Spotify has turned out to be a particularly rich case, I think, to pursue these and similar questions. In the aforementioned project funded by the Swedish Research Council, our aim was to critically engage with the then raging hype around Spotify. Spotify was said to have stopped the downward spiral in revenue that had accompanied physical sales. Spotify was said to have delimited informal practices of media circulation, effectively advancing the fight against non-authorized or pirate forms of file sharing. Spotify also epitomized the platform economy, as it seemed to positively affect supply and demand by bringing more music to more listeners while decreasing marginal and fixed costs. In consequence, Spotify, back then in 2013, had become a model for disseminating all kinds of cultural artifacts, including film, books, games, even church sermons. What was missing in this period of platform enthusiasm before the Cambridge Analytica scandal were so-called negative network externalities or side effects that now dominate debates on platform capitalism, such as surveillance and private data brokerage. Accordingly, with our book, Spotify Teardown, Inside the Black Box of Streaming Music, we aim to disassemble the way Spotify's market is commonly conceptualized, borrowing the notion of teardown from reverse engineering processes. Our teardown, however, was meant in an imaginative rather than purely technical sense. Using experimental digital methods and forms of data-driven knowledge production, alongside ethnographic observation and interviewing, we aim to trace the process of how this digital market is organized and normalized. That is, rather than studying Spotify as a powerful global organization, we chose to follow the process that allowed Spotify to grow from micro to macro size. What did it take to turn a startup with no connection to music into the voice of digital culture, given that its business model was not even sustainable? Spotify, that's the project slide, which I forgot. So that's us. I think actually it was more an ethnographic or anthropological project than an economical, or much has been written about the digital methods, but I think for us it was more like auto-ethnography, and really I think that's where we all felt at home together as a group, and it was really a great group and a super fun project. So Spotify was established in 2006 in Stockholm by two software engineers with a background in advertising technology. And some of you might know this because you have read some texts from the book. So sorry for that. I didn't know that you actually have read the book, which is great. Background in advertising technology, and its name does not hold any particular meaning. The company was structured as a group of firms that used a plurality of jurisdictions for owning different assets. So apart from Spotify Aktiebolaget or limited company, for instance, which is registered as a software company, there's Spotify Sweden, which has the purpose of selling advertising connected to, quote, services for digital distribution of music, film, TV programs, audiobooks, games, and similar content, end of quote, according to its articles of association. The software Spotify first developed was for distributing data over the internet from a central server to a large number of recipients using a peer-to-peer network. In other words, the core idea was to minimize the cost of digital distribution by using extra bandwidth available among the server's users. And it was pretty much a Stockholm thing because Swedes are so much early adopters, and so it really took off. It's really a Stockholm project. And we in the book, we really tried to work out this very Swedish history of Spotify, which is maybe not so present for many of you or many of us, but it's really, I think there's a Stockholm history to this. The kind of data to be distributed was for Spotify a secondary consideration. At the US patent application stated in 2007, quote, "The media may here represent any kind of digital content, such as music, video, digital films, or images," end of quote. In early press releases, Spotify showcased an all-purpose media distribution platform, indicating that in the future it would be used for video. However, video demanded more bandwidth than sound. Spotify became a music streaming service. So the first chapter of our book, I don't know if you have read it, written by Rasmus Fleischer, who is an activist in the pirate movement. So that's his chapter really, where Spotify, this chapter traces Spotify's development through the history of its venture capital funding rounds. The main idea here was to use widely available sources that are normally filtered out, such as speculations, rumors, and promises circulated by the Swedish press and social media and by Spotify, to follow the hype that accompanied Spotify's growth. Hype is more than just the outward construction of a company's culture. It shows how plans and goals are constructed from existing culture in a process of modeling the future. And as you will know, having read the chapter, surprisingly little culture existed in the case of Spotify, and the company really shape-shifted with each funding round, constantly adjusting, if not entirely changing, its main strategies and goals. Again, one focus of the project was on processes of organizing. So instead of centering on Spotify as an organization and on its digital platform, we understood streaming markets as ongoing socio-technical enactments, where various actors come together to fashion modes of exchange, to qualify exchange objects, and to establish market norms. For instance, one chapter, which I wrote, analyzed Spotify as a media company that operates at the intersection of advertising, technology, music, and finance. So what we did was to map the advertising supply chain that provides Spotify to sell its users to advertisers. Spotify adopted so-called programmatic advertising strategies in 2015, and much of the user interface, refashioning into moods and genres introduced at that time, related to the attempt to collect behavioral data for micro-targeting ads. Spotify's growth was based on keeping the service free, and micro-targeting was needed to sell the idea of free to the investment community. In terms of methods, we spoke to key stakeholders, but also tracked the interaction of supply chain vendors online at Spotify's backend, as you can see here in this little video on the screen, to get a sense of the intermediaries that are involved. What we found is that Spotify used automated ad buying to increase the volume of ad revenue before its IPO, underlining that its core leading market was finance rather than recorded music. And you really have to take the book as a piece of history writing, actually. So it really relates to Spotify's history before the IPO. A related second focus was on normalizing and the way how certain market practices are black box and become a matter of indifference. It's just how you do things, right? That is, we're also very interested in what Jonathan Stern has described as politics of standards, the often subtly changing values and politics of cultural dissemination online that are written into the ways music is made accessible via aggregators, technical infrastructures, compression formats, or privacy policies. And here we used bots or pre-programmed scripts as a means to critically consider how Spotify addresses its users through music recommendations, greetings, and personally tailored playlist offerings. So that's, of course, not entirely in accordance with Spotify's terms of service, as they soon found out. The aim with that was to explore how intimacies are imagined and fabricated on the Spotify platform, and to study the political implications of such enactments. As one of the world's largest online music providers, Spotify has a profound capacity to shape everyday realities through digital technologies. by analyzing over 500 pre-designed playlists that were recommended to 3 bot accounts registered in 3 different countries during the course of 1 week, we studied how Spotify helps prescribe normative temporalities, subjectivities, and functional approaches to music, like music you want to feel when you feel down. In one experiment, that's always the best slide, I know. We also used bots to Turing test the Spotify platform. So again, bots can be thought of as programmed informants. I mean, you can use them as informants as you would like in interviewing. And are made up of a patchwork of software programs that are built to mimic human behavior. Would it be possible to manipulate Spotify's monetization system? Does Spotify recognize or care about whether it's interacting with a human listener or a software script? And what could this tell us about the market logics which underline streamed content distribution? For this purpose, we designed an ABBA bot that was, it's terrible, I can turn on the volume, but it sounds just awful. It's like hundreds of them simultaneously. So we designed an ABBA bot that was programmed to listen to ABBA's Dancing Queen on a fixed repetition schedule running from 10 to a couple of thousand times on repeat. Hidden behind a proxy IP address, the ABBA bot succeeded in listening to Dancing Queen over 1,000 times. Even though the experiment did not run flawlessly and only generated a modest amount of revenue, like $5, which we didn't cash in, it revealed that it is, in fact, fairly easy to trick Spotify's system of monetization. This, of course, raises questions about the role of bots in contemporary media systems and the wider implications of fraudulent practices in the context of streamed content distribution. In fact, long before the Neil Young-Joe Rogan dispute or Spotify's patenting of voice assistant technologies, I think Joe Turo is working on that right now, to collect personal data on its users' feelings, there were various matters of public concern related to the organizing and normalizing of Spotify's market practices. For instance, there had been verified reports about fake artists being invented to populate playlists and about a €1 million scam invoking legal fake user accounts. There were licensing and copyright issues, as Spotify had used unlicensed music for the 2 years of its beta phase and has been sued repeatedly for copyright breaches by artists' representatives over the years. So what kind of a digital market is this really, when seen from the viewpoint of market practice? How is this industry made up? What are the formal and informal processes of its making? And where do market actors draw the boundaries between the legal and illegal? Are you still there in the room, or is it getting boring? Okay, good, just checking. Because now I have like another paragraph of a little bit theory. So, but this will soon be over. So it might be useful at this point to distinguish. I don't know if you have read this book, Leslie, in your grade classes. No. So it's really worth reading. It's a human geographer. So it's not like this typical alarmist platform criticism, but he really tries to make a very interesting point about how this economy actually is structured. So I'm using here for making this distinction between 2 different sets of market practices, just in the sense of an analytical distinction. So I'm not claiming there are just 2 kinds of these practices or what you can do in real life. On the one hand, there are proprietary practices where, to paraphrase Brad Christophers, success is based principally on what you control, not what you do. So these kinds of market practices are tied to forms of corporate ownership and platforms as a centralized proprietary mode of cultural production. Again, Christopher's words. And Christopher, as a human geographer, speaks of venture capitalism in the sense of an economic system organized around the assets that generate those rents. So these are practices of giving a legal and economic form to something, be it a patent, a human emotion, traffic through a website, in order to own or control it or its properties as a revenue stream. On the other hand, there are entrepreneurial practices, or what we usually think of when thinking of concrete marketplaces where commodities are compared and exchanged. So this is the area of commercial valuation where things are valued as they are bought and sold as commodities are on any given market. And again, it's only an analytical distinction that may be a little bit useful as we move from Spotify's corporate practices to what individual actors do on and via Spotify. In a subsequent project entitled Shadow Economies of the Internet, also funded by the Swedish Research Council, I've studied market practices that cross the boundaries between legal, illegitimate, and illegal. And what I've found so far, roughly speaking, is that many of these practices at the bottom or in the apparently more informal areas of the digital media economy resemble very much the operating logic at the top in the ways they exploit loopholes in regulation or the absence of sanctioned norms. It's the same economy, even if forms of economic action differ. In other words, the proprietary practices of a CEO like Daniel Ek at Spotify may not be so different in their underlying logics than the practices of some anonymous entrepreneur who uses Spotify for making money out of nothing. It's the same spirit of creative destruction, which I was confronted with repeatedly during this research. So one way is to look at Spotify as a music streaming service or as a media company. And another way is to look at Spotify as a marketplace that forms part in what we'd call the engagement industry. So what I call the engagement industry is the coordinated attempt across platforms and services to alter the outcome and impact of standard metrics on which perceptions of value rely. Everyone knows by now that Facebook likes or Instagram followers are up for sale online, yet buying and selling extend well beyond social media to include music and video streaming services such as Spotify or YouTube, alongside live gaming platforms such as Twitch. Public metrics such as the number of likes, followers, shares, views, or plays are used to measure but also to amplify attention, usage, and revenue. With the platformization of the web and the increasingly close relation between platforms and cultural producers, the web has been reformatted around such standardized forms of engagement that can be compared and traded. Metrics are employed to calculate whether it's profitable to optimize content or to invest in paid for promotion. They enable further data collection and enhance user profiling and personalized advertising services. Elisa, let me just ask, how much time do I actually have? Okay, thank you. In consequence, various actors aim to capitalize on engagement in markets. This includes so-called black hat service and logistic providers that exploit gaps in search engine algorithms and platform security, but importantly also influencers, social media marketers, brands, and platforms. And just to remind you that Spotify was all over the news in 2020 for offering artists pay for play options regarding its radio and autoplay features. So this is just to underline the main point of this research, to see these allegedly white and black markets not as polar opposites, but as being embedded or nested into another. So what I was interested here in finding out is how market actors commodify Spotify plays, likes, or views. So what is a Spotify play or like or follower, economically speaking? How do you sell that? And what does this kind of exchange tell us about Spotify and other digital media? To answer these questions, I looked at entrepreneurs at the supply side, with the aim of following the supply chain from the offer you will find via Google all the way up to the stream, all the way up the stream to its very source. In terms of methods, we used forms of online engagement, observation, and interviews alongside data analysis to understand how these supply side actors think, act, and build the market. I also teamed up with two investigative journalists and a criminologist for part of the project in order to contextualize my findings and to jointly reflect on differences in knowledge production. That was really one of the most interesting things I've ever done, to work together with investigative journalists, not in order to copy their methods at all, but to see how they actually go forward doing this kind of research. So just to give you a quick tour, in case you haven't tried this before, you maybe have tried it out somehow. Everyone has. So there are online shops all over the open internet where you find standard best-selling bulk sales of likes and followers, Spotify plays and so on, tailored to various target groups and demands. So this is the retail level. Actors operating on this level call themselves resellers. Then there's a wholesale level, or what goes by the name of SM panels or social media panels. And panels are on the open internet as well, but they are not directly consumer facing. So the offers you'd find here may look a bit cryptic. Panels have much more on offer than shops, including in no particular order, passport verified PayPal accounts, phone code verification services, Netflix accounts, Amazon reviews, referral traffic from news outlets such as the New York Times, and so on and so on. So what you see here is one large provider listing more than 400 active services from 40 different sources on his site. It's basically a 400-page catalog. Now, what is interesting is what happens on the way from panels to shops or wholesale to retail, because this is where all the issues of legality or illegality come in. And the reason for that is that the panel infrastructure is global, largely global, while the shops are largely local. Shops offer services for users active in a particular national market and therefore have to comply with state-sanctioned norms, at least not to violate them. And this reflects both on what you would find in a shop as compared to a panel and how these shop owners act as compared to the panel owners. For instance, if you look for Spotify plays in a German online shop, you'd find smaller batches of Spotify plays available for purchase. The justification for selling plays and so on is that this is just to boost attention in the way record labels or book publishers once might have bought part of a first printing to boost their sales. So in a way, this is a commercial service offered to remedy market failures in the attention economy. The picture is a bit different when you look at panels, because buying directly from panels, you are able to scale up and really game the system. So for instance, here you can buy unlimited numbers of plays for any song that is available worldwide, meaning that Spotify then pays more to the rights holders of that song. That's how it works. We tested it actually, teaming up with Germany's most famous rock musician, Peter Maffay. It was his idea, not mine. So he used one of his songs and we bought plenty of fake plays, and he was happy to prove that Spotify is the worst thing in the world. 70 years old, 50 years on the market, and streaming just sucks. But here's the point. So let me just quickly portray two entrepreneurs at different ends of the supply chain. So on the one hand, we have a man in his late 20s named Jonas, based in Berlin. There's nothing hidden about him. You can see him, find him on the internet, who founded a limited company called Social Media Daily back in 2010, and now makes between $20,000 and $50,000 per month with his services. On the other hand, we have a man of about the same age named Volchek, based in Rostov-on-Don, Russia, operating a panel since 2012. And Volchek is one of the trusted sources of Jonas and claims to have about 5,000 customers like Jonas, with between 900 and 52,000 orders per day. So you can imagine it's huge. And actually, Volchek is only a middleman as well, because there's still a larger infrastructure above him. No time to speak about that. So what Jonas does, he fully complies with the GDPR, like the European General Data Protection Regulation and German tax legislation, and puts the burden of platform terms of service compliance squarely on its customers' shoulders. It is not illegal in Germany to service Spotify plays, likes or followers, because so far it couldn't be proven in court that existing legal norms are applicable, as shops are only resellers and not the source of the plays or likes they offer. In other words, only some actions in this market are legal, and these illegal aspects are embedded in perfectly legal organizations, take place within legal market structures, and stem from otherwise. Now, both Jonas and Volchek are part of a much larger market infrastructure. It's depressing, actually. That's also why I have difficulties in publishing this. It's you really don't want to know. And the key organizing principle is the absence of any hierarchical order. I mean, that's how the internet works, right? So you cut out one actor and it still works. So in other words, panels are also only resellers. So when you try to speak to panel owners, they always would say, well, I'm only reselling. I'm not making these things. I'm just getting them from somewhere. And they're sourcing their plays or likes largely from other actors, some of which are bots and some of which are authentic human operated accounts. This market infrastructure has only grown over the past 10 years and makes it rather complicated to decide who's responsible before the law and who isn't. And while this market grows and expands, various non-state actors push for illegalizing it for reasons that have little to do with the law. And that's almost my conclusion. For instance, American news media have linked this market to notions of fake news, advertising fraud, and identity theft using an evocative imagery of offshore follower factories or click farms supposedly located in the global south. In this narrative, digital sweatshops in Indonesia and elsewhere form part in a global labor arrangement designed to serve consumer brands, top politicians, and entertainment celebrities of the global north. And it's a misleading narrative because this is not a shadow or informal market, as I've tried to show, and it can't be limited to the global south by any means. And it has nothing to do with fakes or false representations of value, as the money made on this market is very real. It's also a narrative that enables traditional news media to position themselves as the better alternative to platforms such as Facebook. Another Spotify-related example are music industry associations, such as the German Bundesverband Musikindustrie, the Federal Music Industry Association, which repeatedly used legal action to establish legal precedent, not only in order to fight fraudulent practices, but also explicitly in order to get Spotify itself to commit against such practices. So what they did was to use legal court cases to make Spotify co-sign an anti-streaming manipulation code of best practices, which rules out plays resulting from any pay for play arrangement, including Spotify's own arrangements, among others. So neither of these attempts to push for state legislation has had any lasting consequences so far, as I'm aware of, which suggests once more that legal extra legal markets are not outside of the boundary of capitalist markets. They are part and parcel of the capitalist economy. And I think before you fall asleep, and I'm going over time, I've had to wrap it up here. So I can't really say anything about the project I'm most excited of, which is, so I just, can you show you this slide? So we just started it, and because the idea was, like, I mean, we are always, always too late doing this sort of platform critical research, right? So I teamed up with a colleague who is in organization, so management studies, who has written a beautiful book about secrecy. So I think that's also a hot topic, I think, actually for media industries. So it's at Stanford University Press, her book with Christopher Gray, Secrecy in Organizing. So we figured that could be an interesting framework to study how these sorts of conversations between Google and so on and policymakers in Brussels are like organized. How do these people get together? How does it actually work to lobby for Google as a company? And I'm really surprised how easy it is to get access, actually, to the politicians, because everyone wants to prove that they're not part of the really dark sides of lobbying. And yeah, but we just started, so I have no reason. I mean, we have done 10 interviews. We have to do at least 40 to 60, I think, and then go into some sort of ethnographic observation on site. And so I'm just excited about it, but I have nothing really to contribute at this point. But thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope we can speak a little bit about it.
It's made a real challenge in terms of antitrust legislation. Like, what do you define as a market? I know Facebook set its own terms and said when they were trying to acquire Instagram, like they're in a separate market, it wouldn't be an antitrust violation, right? So they were kind of setting their own terms. I'm just wondering, who is doing that definitional work? Who should be doing that definitional work in the research you've seen so far?
So I'm really not into the normative area. So I'm not I'm not trying to say who should do whatever. So I'm really trying to understand who's doing what. And I'm using all this sociological literature out of it, but I'm not a sociologist. So it's like sort of getting into a social research approach of what digital media are, basically, right? I think much of the work we're doing is really like not trying to be representative. So it's not about the bigger picture, but really following, some actors in some little niche or corner of these digital markets, or whatever we call them. Actually, I think it's quite, I'm getting this question now because I'm drawn into, one backlash of having success with the Spotify book is that everyone in the music scene really loved it. And we get constant couldn't you help us fight Spotify? And, answer this kind of questions. And I think it's really tricky. I mean, you will know this as you're also in the media industry's research, like, do you want really to become this kind of an expert who goes out there and tells them, what we should and what we shouldn't? Yeah, I really can't answer it on a broader general level because I'm just trying to follow these sort of practices and then, sort of build sort of a picture of the market I'm observing.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. We're in Texas with Spotify and legally obligated to ask the Joe Rogan question. So here it is. When it comes to sort of with everything that's been going on with Joe Rogan and Neil Young, and then you have sort of all these folks who have decided that they want to protest Spotify by trying to cancel their accounts. Where do you see potentially the role of an individual, whether it's an or not an audience member, I suppose a user in this case, or a performer? Where do you see the role of an individual potentially taking place within these sort of larger webs that we're looking at here? And do you think that it's possible that that role may be changing? Could it be expanding? Could it be diminishing? Where do you see where we're at with that right now?
Well, when you are the experts on the American market, right? So I can just speak about what's happening in Germany, in my little corner of the world.
Yeah.
And what I think is that individuals have much more power than you would assume. Like today I got an email by a singer, Bambina, I've never heard of, but she seems to be so popular in Germany.
And she's trying to bring together a huge coalition of musicians to actually, she already is in sort of a process, she wrote to me, like talking to lawmakers, like our politicians, to change the law. And 2 weeks ago, this strange Peter Maffay group, they also tried to draw me into a court case they're preparing against Spotify. So these are basically individuals. Of course, the Maffay group, these are like, top managers for the German context. But of course, you can do something when there is, like appropriate sort of legal frameworks. And I think it might look quite different in Germany from what it looks in the States, because in Germany, you could actually sue Spotify for, it has 70% of the streaming market, and you could sue them for sort of monopoly. So I think they have really a possibility to do that if they really want to do that. But as you know all yourself, it's actually a very complicated picture. It's not only the musicians, and you have Universal, the labels, and all these interdependencies. And but I was quite intrigued that people come forward, they're like doing things, and so I think maybe the best way to change things would be to establish other forms of monetization, right? Like user-centric. It's like, I don't know if it's a big story in the States right now, but in Germany, there's a push for user-centric, like go into a different direction when it comes to monetization. There's a startup in Berlin called Resonate, and they developed a different monetization approach. And Deezer was supposedly going into the same direction. So I don't know how it's in the States. What kind of discussions you are having here in this regard?
There's a lot of tension with like using the context of what music can be as the kind of a cultural object versus the kind of like financialization processes that are happening right under the surface. And so you use terms like hype and creative disruption. And I'm like wondering how much of like the ideological or semiotic function of those terms come to bear on the kind of like obscuring of the broader financialization processes over these three projects, and just kind of how that is oriented in your work and maybe even framed in some of your research questions when you're talking with professionals in the industry and how you kind of negotiate that boundary?
That's a super good question. So what I tried is to like trace these sort of, you know, creative destruction, these kinds of ideas back to what these entrepreneurs do. So like in their daily work, and it's not necessary that they really talk about, you know, the larger picture, but how they actually perform this kind of work and the ideas they have about their own cultural labor and building this market. I think is quite interesting and indicative of these broader issues, like, you know, what are they thinking they're doing actually, you know. The system is going too slow, so we have to disrupt it, and so that's what I'm interested in, you know, like sort of it's not really an ideology or a larger frame for them, but it's something, sometimes it's more like out of the daily routines of doing this kind of stuff. And so one interesting aspect of the project also was, as you can imagine, I mean, I don't know if it's feasible to ask this, but maybe you've tried it once, selling, buying likes, anyone? Because I mean, it's super easy, you know, I think many companies do it, so it's not so secret at all. But it's very difficult to actually get these people talking who are operating the services. So I just showed you actually my main informant, this Jonas. He had, of course, an agenda why he would speak with me. Because as I learned from sociology, that in illegal markets, there's often an attempt to bring in state actors to somehow legalize your own. Right? So as being employed at the university and a neutral academic, I could help him bring this sort of out of the shadows. And actually that's why so the journalists I showed to you, they published a great story in Vice, and it was not judgmental about these people. So many more actually came to us afterwards and wanted to talk, but because they said, we don't have any market intelligence, like the market is blind, we can't promote our services openly. So this is great for us. Please do more research, do more, you know, stories and in the news about this. But yeah, I hope I could a little bit relate to your question. Great question indeed. I think there are two. You first.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Super fascinating. And actually, what you just touched upon, I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little more on what it was like to collaborate with the journalists and how that came about, and yeah, what the process was like.
Yeah. So in terms of method, I think I learned two things as being a amateur ethnographer. So this with the journalist is the best thing of the entire project for me. And it came at a point where we actually had been contacted by NATO. So NATO came to one of our workshops in Stockholm, which my colleague Johan Lindqvist in social anthropology organized. And they had an entirely different narrative about this. So, you know, in light of what's happening in Ukraine, you could think that maybe it's not too far-fetched, but to me, it seemed a little bit paranoid, which is all these social media panels are part of a giant militarization machine. You know, they figured that soldiers could be somehow tricked into using their phones to leave their, you know, get out of their soldier's role or whatever. This is getting too big. You know, I don't want to get into this sort of narrative, but talk with journalists and then give this part of the research to them. So that's how this collaboration came about. Visualize this sort of research and how they would be able to confront, you know, actors you wouldn't want to confront. And so I really only can warmly recommend this. And we did the same with the lobbying project. Like the first people we spoke to were journalists specializing on lobbying. So there are a few accredited journalists working in Brussels, and they opened all the doors for us. So for anyone doing this sort of industry research, I really can warmly recommend working with journalists, at least for parts of the project. And then also another recommendation, maybe it's silly for the experts, but what I also really liked, or still like, is now in the lobbying project, we do all the interviews, like we are always two on our side. I don't know if it's usual here. Normally you would be alone, right? But this completely changes the power game. And and then kind of deliberately teamed up with a woman who is working in business administration, like, you know, Cambridge, Oxford, LSE scholar. So it totally changes the ball game. And So you have this sort of interaction where they really try to live up to the academic experts they believe to be us. So yeah, that's one other thing. If you're asking for methods, like methods inputs, think about it, like teaming up with someone. If it's not intimidating, of course, for the interviewee, I mean, it's sort of balance to be kept. But yeah, I hope this answers your question a little bit.
What about the terminology?
Yeah, she's fantastic. Mazara, she just finished her PhD. She is an assistant professor now at the University of Montreal. And actually, it was the journalists who found her. I hadn't found her work, and then we invited her. She came to Germany, and she is great. I think she's the only person who really did research on this on a data level. And together with her team, they identified a botnet, and botnets are clearly illegal. It's clearly criminal. So that's what we wanted to have the conversation, because I'm always saying, you know, maybe it's not illegal, you know. And then she said, yeah, it's definitely illegal. It's no way around it. And then now she has, like, the dissertation was published, and you can find it on her website. And she has given a number of talks about this as well. So that was a very, very interesting encounter as well. And yeah, I think there's still room for talking more about this, actually, with the criminologist, and, you know, not to give too many ideas away for free, but I think it would be interesting to do a conference on crime and the internet, you know, because we have all this stuff with shadows and informal, but much more interesting to look, I think, in clearly criminal conduct online and in terms of industry relations. I think they are like, you go first.
Thank you for this talk. This was incredibly fascinating. And I actually had this question written down, but it segues real nicely with the previous two questions, which this stems from one of your images coming from Rolling Stone and referencing someone as a digital marketer. And I wanted to ask, what role does the popular press play in either clarifying and or obfuscating legality and illegality practices through their own discursive practices in the ways they either label the actors they're talking about or through positive press reports? And could they potentially be complicit in these illegal or unethical practices that Spotify and others are somewhat interwoven into in these networks that you're speaking of?
Thank you very much. Extremely good question. No, I don't think they're not complicit with sort of building an illegal or shadowy market, but they're contributing to a narrative, you know. And so I think it's very interesting to think. I mean, we are not market scholars, right? for good reason. But I think it's very interesting to think about markets in terms of narratives, because, you know, they even like narrative economics now. There's you know, the Nobel Prize for, I don't know who it was. So I think the idea of narrative in actually building a market, these stories are told. And so the first thing, like, we got the funding because, no, we wrote the research application because there were all these stories, a big New York Times investigative report, Follower Factory, then this one I showed, and it felt so strange. Like, you know, the idea that people sit there and tipping on keyboards. And my colleague with whom I applied for the funding, he's a social anthropologist and has worked a lot in Indonesia. And he said, let's check it out. And he flew there and did 20 interviews as a pilot before we applied for the funding. And no, it's bullshit. They are not, I mean, it's not, you can't really imagine these people sitting there and clicking on a keyboard. So that was actually where our research started, was sort of like skepticism about this sort of media narrative. And I don't think there's a larger ideology or strategy behind it. I think it's mostly convenience. So I tried to trace back where the story came from. And I think it all originated in a lunch presentation by 2 BA students in Italy, which was picked up by the New York Times digital blog person because Nancy Baim had sort of referred to it. So that's how I construct, like, you know, so this is the data, like, you know, and then you understand that basically it's just copy pasted and then sent out over the internet. So I think deconstructing these sorts of like narrative tropes can be a way into the field. But then I think it's also more to it. It's like the entire market is organized through narratives, and these informants would tell you stories from beginning to end. NATO tells us a story, you know, so you start thinking a lot about these stories, and so I think it's an interesting avenue to pursue for research, for future research too. Yeah.
I'm actually asking a question for Wen Hong
Okay.
on the Zoom. She says, wonderful talk, Patrick. What's your take on Spotify's long-term business model?
Thank you, Vonderau. I have no idea. She already said that yesterday that you would ask me.
Vonderau, you said that yesterday that you would ask this question. And honestly, I mean, at some point we decided to leave Spotify. I mean, this talk was sort of framed with the Spotify narrative, but we also got a little bit tired, I have to say, after they tried to sort of shut the project down. And then, yeah, I felt it's not necessarily good for us to identify with this role they tried to put us in, right? So we're often approached by some news media like to comment on Spotify or about what happened back then to us, which, yeah, I think it's a story which is not so interesting. Yeah, but sorry, I have no idea. I haven't really followed what has happened after the IPO, to be honest. So it's all up for grabs. You should do some better research.
I just want to ask, because you mentioned like creative destruction in the Q&A and presentation, and just like given the nature of like mapping digital markets and industries, and that there's constant change and innovation since it is sort of on the newer end of the curve, things are popping up, disappearing. What are the challenges for you as a researcher to like map these supply chains, or I guess better described as like as networks? Like how do you overcome that? Is that something that's you would characterize your work as, or?
Very good question as well. I think it's super annoying and difficult. It's like a moving target. So yeah, do historical work. I mean,
only people who are dead.
Yeah, exactly. Or wait it out until it's doesn't exist anymore. I think it's really makes it super difficult. And also I mean, like we got the funding for these projects because they were so, you know, it's in the news, and you know, it's like, but I think it's also makes it difficult to do the actual research. So sometimes it's better to wait it out. But on the other hand, because you linked this question to creative destruction, I think you could also argue that, you know, Spotify and Facebook and so on, they slowed down. So they're not destructive anymore. So they're like becoming institutions. And that's why all these actors come in and try to, you know, like to fill in the gaps and to break up the system, right? Which is interesting, I think. But in terms of research strategy, it's, yeah, I mean, you might know it yourself. You have done this kind of research, so you would know what a hassle it can be.
Can I ask you a question about your funding? So I'm tied to this question as well. So is the funding more for projects that are more recent, current, contemporary, or so how do you like apply for grants, or how do you conceptualize the projects?
Thank you. So these two projects, the first two projects we applied for in Sweden. So it's quite a tough competition. It's about 5% of all applications which actually get funding. We got a lot of funding for the Spotify project, like in terms of the humanities, like 1 million or so, which is nice. But we were also 5 people. So it's and over a period of 4 years. So at the end, it's not so much as compared to what the natural sciences would get. There's absolutely no need to apply for money in this particular area. You know, so you know, they're funding whatever, like art historical projects. So there's, in terms of funding strategy, I think you can always be wrong. And it's always a little bit luck to get this kind of money. And in Germany, to apply for funding, there's a much higher chance actually when you go to the large foundations. And this is like the largest foundation in Sweden. So the project we applied for now is also quite large, but like you would have a 20-25% chance of getting funded. But again, there's never sort of a decision made, but like in terms of, oh, this is, you know, something which brings us the funders in the news. I don't think so, because they really outsource the decision making to other academics. So there's really a hard competition.
Are you doing any historical projects now? Because I know you've done a bunch in the past, and how has that been, like, in terms of getting funding? And I kind of know the answer, but I'm asking for this.
Yeah, I mean, we had also have two historic projects. One which was running parallel to the Spotify project, which was a project on the history of the relation between advertising and film. So we didn't really want to make a project about commercials, but look more into moving images and promotional, like in a very broad sense. So that's what we got funding for. And there's the book you mentioned, came out last year as a result of project involving 3 people. And then I've got funding as a follow-up to this historical project together with a colleague in Stockholm, Marina Dahlqvist, for a project on the relations between non-theatrical or sponsored film and the oil industry. Yeah, and you know, it's a little bit like a curse because there's so much what you actually can do. So sometimes I think, yeah, I mean, it means that we have really to think hard how we break it down and make it manageable, because yeah, you living in Texas, you know how many archives there are actually for related to the oil industry, and there's lots of things you could study. So these are like the 2 historical projects I've got funding for.
Is there one more question? Someone want to close this out? Stephanie.
I have a question about like the local and global aspect of Spotify. You talked about like the fights that the creators are doing locally, but then Spotify is like a global platform. I wonder how much of the local actions that are taken can have like a global effect. Is it happening only in Germany or in Europe, or
You mean like legal action?
legal actions or anything related to creativity?
Good question. I think it really depends. I think, for instance, I mean, I don't know. I mean, so I'm most focused on these sort of legal disputes, right? That's what I related to. But I think if actually a decision would be made in Germany to sort of break Spotify's streaming monopoly in the German-speaking countries, and I think that would have reverberations beyond Germany, you know. And I mean, Spotify is still also a European company, right? So our book had quite an impact for them in a negative way, I would say. So that was a big surprise, because the project was never meant, you know, to provoke the giant. It just happened. But I think they didn't like it. So that shows that even some poor scholars in the humanities can poke the bear, right? And I think they're really pissed with the sort of song blocker stuff, and so we I mean, making fun of them, and we could see it a little bit in the backlash. I mean, they're like, when we published the story about Spotify trying to shut down the project, we didn't know what would happen if, you know, we would get supported by the tabloids, for instance, in Sweden, because Spotify is such a holy cow. But actually, everyone loved us and not them. But that was, you know, it's no risk I would ever ask anyone to take, because you don't know what actually is happening. But that showed really that you can change things. But there was also a backlash. There were some people clearly associated with Spotify who would sort of post stuff. I mean, good criticism of the project, but where you felt, yeah, it's sort of a contested space. So yeah, just to say that, yeah, I think of course you can make an impact. Just think about a good strategy to do so. Team up with other people.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. This was really great. As I think you know, CME is